Hello, this little video is looking at paper 2 and question 4. Now be familiar hopefully with the structure of the question and how to respond to the question. So you're going to be comparing the two texts and you're going to be kind of working on this structure that you've got here. So you're going to be talking about the writer's thoughts and feelings, and then you're going to be linking that to the techniques that the writer uses, and then you're going to be linking it into the reasons why and the perspective. How does that link all together? Now today we're going to have a look at this bit here. How can we get better at talking about techniques and language? And if you have a look in the text, you can see that one of the bullet points means that you have to talk about the methods, and that's the things that the writer does, so the techniques, the things about language. Okay, so this question is really about thinking about how the writer thinks and feels, what the writer uses to show what they're thinking and feeling, and how that's linked to their situation. So we're going to kind of give an example. So there's Mr. Curtis, and he's got a hammer and he's accidentally hammers his hand while he's hammering a nail into the wall. And he says, oops. Okay. Now we know from this that he's probably in pain. So we know he's feeling in pain and he's probably thinking, ow, that really hurts. Now he says, oops. And that's kind of to show that he's in pain and that's what's happened. But also, in the room at the moment, at the time, was his grandfather. And so we can understand that he probably said oops when he could have said something else because his grandfather was there and he didn't want to upset him. So we can see how the thoughts and the feelings reflect in the language, but also the situation affects the language and affects the thoughts and feelings that's going on. So what we're doing in this question is linking these different bits together. Now, if we have a look, there tends to be two types of students when writing about language. And you have students who are very, very general about writing about things. And here we've got a typical general student. And what they do is they're very, very vague with what they say. So they will say the writer uses the word, the writer uses the phrase, the writer uses the language, the writer uses this. So the problem with this is that that's not really talking about language. All you're doing with this is just spotting something in there. The writer uses lots of words, lots of phrases, lines, and language. There's no real skill. And if we have a look at the marking, how students are marked, this student will do better than this one, simply because they're using technical terminology. And the examiner will be looking to see that you're using technical terminology, or whoever is marking your question. So if we have a look, so we need to be talking about things like this: the verb, the simile, the contrast. There's loads of other things that we can talk about. These are just three that we've picked to give you an idea. So instead of saying the word, use the verb. Instead of saying the phrase, say the simile. Instead of saying the line, say the contrast. And you can see how we're being more precise. And that's what separates some students from others, is they're more precise with the words that you've used. So let's look at this from the point of view of language. So some students think it's really, really hard to look at language. But actually, we're using language all the time, every day. You're reading it, you're listening to it, and you're writing it. So let's have a look at it. So what could we do when we get a text and we need to think about the language? Well, the first thing you can do is look at the language and say, is the language positive or negative? Straight away, we've done better than that vague student. We've been precise. We can say the writer uses positive language. Example, example. But also we can do a bit more. Is the language emotive? Is it trying to create an emotion? Is it visual, trying to build a picture? Is it sensory, trying to put us there? Is it formal, serious? Or is it informal, quite friendly and personal? But then there's even more, because then we can have a look at it further and say, well, actually the language is quite aggressive or flattering, polite or vague. The writer's not quite clear what they're trying to say, or they're hiding something. Or are they very direct and blunt? So all these words are words that we're quite familiar with, and we can easily talk about any text in terms of this. And we can pick things out and say the writer has gone very positive with the language and they've used this. But we can even go further than that, because we can say whether the writing exaggerated, whether they've gone over the top, or whether it's understated. They're kind of hinting things, they're kind of suggesting things, but they're not being overly top. And then linked to that, we can start linking into techniques. And we can say, well, when writers are exaggerating, they often use repetition, or they show that exaggeration through the verbs. And if writers are understating things, they can use symbols or the tone of things to hint or suggest things. So you can see there's quite a number of things straight away that we can talk about with language without having to rush straight through and think about technical terms, because we're using language all the time and we can talk about it. And that's why this text is quite easy when we look at it from this way. Now, these are some techniques that we've talked about in years 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, and these are sort of things that you could be spotting. There'll not be all of these in a text, there might be one or two, and you've just got to look for them. So I'm going to go through. All right, not all of these will be in a text, but we're going to go through just to remind you. So, contrast, list, pairs, particularly verbs and adjectives, extreme detail, close-ups, colours, imagery, natural imagery, omniscient narrator. That's when the narrator is acting like God, but they know it all. Simile, comparing one thing to another. Triplet, repetition, symbols, diamond, conflict, sound effects like rhyme, onomatopoeias, verbs, adjectives, setting, religious reference or allusions, violence, pronouns like he, she, I, light and darkness imagery, animal imagery, mirroring, foreshadowing, oxymoron, when you've got two things that don't seem quite right but actually do make sense together, hyperbole, rhyming couplet, emotive language, personification, metaphor, soliloquy, and dramatic irony. Now, we wouldn't expect all of those, but one or two we would expect. Now we're going to have a look at how we can approach the exam question and how we can go through it. Now, generally, the extracts that are chosen for exam papers, they will have a simile, they will have some good verbs in them, they will have some good little bits of description, and certainly some adjectives to describe the characters or the people in it. And we've got here is we're going to have a go looking at how we can use language to link everything together. So we've gone for a very straightforward opening to a sentence. The writer feels amazed. So straight away we've got the inference there that the writer is amazed. Okay. So just quickly have a look at that text there and see if you can spot the techniques in there that we could talk about that show that the writer is amazed. Now I'm going to go through some of the things you could have mentioned. Now, usually there'll be lots of things in the text, so we're not going to pick everything. We're just going to pick a few. So we could talk about the verb, fluttering. We could talk about the list. And lists are quite straightforward. We could talk about, there seems to be lots of phrases to do with bees. So we've got the semantic field of bees. And that just means a group of words that are all connected to one thing. So we can have the semantic field of war, or the semantic field of animals, or animal imagery. So we use the phrase semantic field just to describe when we've got words that are closely linked together. And we've got the verb glide here. How does she move? So you can see there's a number of things there. Now, you really only need a few when talking about this. And so we've got to think about, well, how does this idea that the writer is amazed, how is this reflected in all these different things here? And we're going to have a look at how you can do that. So one of the things you need to think about is actually what's actually going on here. So, for example, the writer is amazed. So the fluttering is to describe this teacher. So the teacher is fluttering. So the idea here, is it positive or negative word? Well, it's quite a positive, and it almost sounds like a butterfly or something very, very good. And so we're seeing this idea that the writer is amazed because of the way that they behave. They seem like they're too good and amazing, and almost like what they're doing is, it seems beautiful, maybe with this choice of word here, that with their fluttering, it's almost like it's effortless. And we can see that he's impressed because he's seeing and he's describing him in such a way that doesn't seem like an ordinary person. So they're behaving in an extraordinary way. Well, then we've got this idea about a hive of activity and queen bee, which gives us this idea that really, maybe, the thing about with bees, and if you know and you've got to use your knowledge about this, is bees tend to be quite organized. And so we got this idea that there's very, very clear and there's a good form of structure and a kind of idea about power as well, because you have a queen bee who's in charge and controlling everything, and all the bees are organized. And so there seems to be a smooth running of this whole idea. Right, let's look at the next one then. The verb glided. Well, if something glides, it seems to be very smooth movement, isn't it? It's a smooth movement, and it's almost like it's a perfect movement. And you can see that exploring what the word means helps you to understand. So this teacher moves in such a smooth, perfect way. And if we look at these words together, it gives us this overall picture of why he's so amazed about things. He's amazed because it looks like what they're doing is effortless. But he's also amazed about how everything is so organized and smooth, and how there seems to be no flaws in what's happening here. Everything seems to be possibly too perfect. And so you can see that what we're doing is we're building that picture up so we can see how the writer has used the word and how does it link into the writer's feelings. Now we're going to think about the inspector, because this is about an inspector. Okay, he's looked at this school, this teacher, and he's describing him in this way, that this fluttering teacher, that's queen bee and that glides, gives this idea that maybe he's never seen anything like this before, and it seems possibly too good to be true. So we can see how these feelings link into that word, and it shows us the thought that's going on. Is it too good to be true? That could be the thought. He is amazed. And we know that this is an inspector. So obviously an inspector's there to judge. And so when he sees something so smooth, he might be thinking, right, is this really the case? What's going on here? And so we can see that we're building up this picture of using the terminology, thinking about what the writer feels, thinking about what they think, and then thinking about the perspective. Because if you're an inspector, you might have seen something like this before. And so you might see people trying to fool you and trying to trick you. And so he might be thinking that they're pretending, that this is all an act and they're not really this good. It seems to be too good to be true, doesn't it? So going back to the question then. So for the question, we've got there, we start off with the writer's thoughts and feelings, and then we link it into the techniques and then the reasoning. And so don't be worried about the choice of words. Just be really, really careful and precise. Be precise with the terms and the techniques that you're referring to. And if unsure, talk about what kind of language is being used. Now, a few key points to end with. Question 4 wants you to analyse the language choices. So spend time talking about how the language reflects the thoughts and feelings of the writer. Don't be scared of terminology. It's better to attempt it than get it wrong. And really, a student will do better than a student who uses the simple word phrase. So avoid the word or phrase or line. Zoom in and use technical terms. If you're struggling with what to say about the language, then give a definition of a word. And rather than listing lots of things, try and say a lot about one thing. So try and say 3 things about that word or technique that you've spotted. And if you found an interesting verb, say 3 things about what that verb is. What's interesting about it? What does it tell us? What does it mean? And be really, really precise with the feelings and the technique. And spend your time writing this question, trying to explain the link between the feelings and the technique, and say how the technique shows the feeling. Do have a look at our YouTube channel. There are lots of other language videos on there, particularly on question 4, to give you an idea of how to get better and how to improve.